Young and Harvey Newman and Kalechi
Uzachuku.
Interviewing Mike Trotter. I'll get that eventually. But I think that that's actually where we're starting, is how you came to be in Atlanta and, you know, to be involved and sort of start your career here. So it sounds like your career started at Georgia State as a...
Well, my father was a professor of mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech.
Mm-hmm.
And he and my mother met at the University of Wisconsin, where they were both in school. And she was from Arkansas. And he got a job at Georgia Tech in 1930, when jobs were hard to come by.
Mm-hmm.
And they moved to Atlanta. I was born in 1936 at the Emory Hospital, went to the Clark Howell School on 10th Street and the Grady High School, graduating in 1954. And then went off to college at Brown, and I was in the PhD program in American History at Harvard as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, and decided I was right next to the law school. I had friends in the law school. I found I liked what they were doing better than what I was doing, so I switched over to the law school the next year. And among the more important courses I took a course from a man named Sheldon Gluck, who was the leading juvenile delinquency expert in the country. And I wrote my paper in the course on the Georgia Juvenile Court Act and then why it was obsolete and needed to be changed. And that I came to work for the Alston Law Firm, worked there in the summer of 60 and 61. I became an associate when I graduated in 62. And the paper I had written got published in the Georgia Bar Journal. And as a result of that, I was asked to serve on the Juvenile Delinquency Committee of the Bar Association. And then in 1965, I guess, Ivan Allen appointed the Atlanta Commission on Crime and Juvenile Delinquency, which I think was the first significant biracial commission in the city. And I was asked to serve as counsel for the Juvenile Delinquency Committee, which was chaired by Dr. William Holmes Borders. And it, one thing led to another, I guess, but that's sort of how I got started. And I was encouraged by the Alston firm. In those days, law firms were not as interested in making money and more interested in perhaps in public service. Also, they couldn't solicit clients in those days, so the best way to develop a clientele was to be active in the community and to meet people while you were doing something for the community.
So what was the focus of the Atlanta Commission?
Well, it took a very broad view of the problems of crime in the city. Griffin Bell was the chairman. Billy Stern, who was the chairman of Sun Trust, was the vice chairman. And it actually may have something for you that would give you all that information, but we wrote a report called, what was it called? Well, I've got it downstairs. That was quite well received, was published, distributed, and it had chapters on housing, poverty, juvenile delinquency, and other aspects of crime in the community, and recommended that a number of steps be taken to improve the quality of life in the community. And in particular, the Juvenile Delinquency Committee recommended the creation of something called the Atlanta Children and Youth Services Council, which was to coordinate youth services in the city. This was really modeled on one in New York City. I went up and visited with them, and we prepared the report, and in fact the Atlanta Children and Youth Services Council was set up. Bob Wood, who is the general attorney for Sears Roebuck, which in those days was one of the most important organizations in Atlanta. The Southeastern headquarters was here. And I was Franklin Thomas, who was the executive director of the Butler Street YMCA, was the vice chairman. I was the secretary. Mrs. Rhodes Purdue was the treasurer. And Grace Hamilton was appointed by Mayor Allen as the interim executive director while we searched for a full-time director. And Mrs. Hamilton decided she'd like to be the full-time director as well as continuing to serve in the legislature and so forth. And the board felt that we really needed someone who could devote their full time to it. Ms. Hamilton brought as much pressure to bear on Franklin as she could through the board of the Y, but unsuccessfully. Franklin was a wonderful, strong, independent individual who did what he thought was right. And so we hired a young man named John Cox as the executive director. And John had an office in City Hall. He was the first African-American, quote, department head in the city government. He created quite a furor when he invited Stokely Carmichael and Rap Brown to visit him in City Hall. They it was absolute pandemonium, I'm told. John's position was that if he was going to deal with the problems in the community, he needed to know what the other folks thought about all this. And Mayor Allen backed him up, and he kept his job. And I'm not sure how long the Atlanta Children and Youth Services Council lasted. Somehow faded from view, I think, in the early 70s. But because of the relationship I developed with Franklin Thomas, I was asked to serve as the director of the Butler Street YMCA. And at the time, the only two white members were myself and Zenith Sears. If you like rhythm, blues, and the jive, Daddy Sears will keep you alive. He predates you, I'm sure, but he was a disc jockey and owner of WAOK.
Okay.
Which was our favorite radio station, of course, those days, for the young folks. Yeah. So somewhere along the way, I got a call, I think it was about 1966, to come to Mills Lane's office. And Mills Lane, as I'm sure you know, was at least the second most important businessman in Atlanta. Robert Woodruff probably was more important, but Mr. Lane was the one on the outside. Mr. Woodruff was inside. And the C&S Bank at the time was the largest bank in the southeastern United States, and it had been extremely successful. And although Mr. Lane had a run-in with Yale over giving an honorary doctorate degree to Martin Luther King Jr., Mr. Lane was a graduate of Yale. He was very public-spirited, and he was very concerned with the entire community. And that, I think, was in part because in those days, banks could not branch outside of the city limits of the town in which they had offices in 1926 or some such, when the state passed a very restrictive branch banking law. And therefore, the bank was locked into the city limits of Atlanta. It had a branch in Savannah and a couple of other cities, but so what happened in Atlanta was very important to the bankers. And when I got to Mr. Lane's office, Mayor Allen was there, and Philip Alston, who was the senior partner in my law firm. And Mr. Lane said that Mayor Allen said there were 6,000 people on the waiting list for the Atlanta Housing Authority, and that the city wanted to provide safe and sanitary housing, is how it was described in those days, for for all these people. Did not have the resources to do it itself, but there was a new government program, 221D3, that permitted nonprofit sponsors to sponsor, in effect, semi-public housing. And it occurred to me, I approached Dr. King's organization, and I never met Dr. King. It's one of my great regrets, but there was a man in his organization who was in charge of the housing part of it, and he basically just wanted the money, and my people wanted to be involved in the process. And so it occurred to me that the Butler Street YMCA would make an excellent sponsor for such a project. And we put together the Butler Y Homes on Hollywood Boulevard. We persuaded the YMCA to put a branch of the Butler Street YMCA at that location. Mr. Alston was chairman of a couple of foundation boards, and he put up the money to build a community center at the Butler Y Homes, which are still there, by the way. They're a mess, or were a mess. I don't know what they are today. And so I went on the board of Butler Y Homes with Fletcher Coombs and I think Bill Calloway, maybe Q.V. Williamson. And that's another story. It was not a successful project over the longer term, and the government took it back. The Crime Commission had been very well received, and those of us who were on the staff had gotten to know a lot about the city. And it was Bill Alexander was the only African American on the staff, but that in itself in those days was a major accomplishment. And the other members included people such as Emmett Bondurant, Clay Long, Tred Davis, Jerry Luxemburger, Buck Griffin, myself. And I decided that we ought to use the knowledge we had gained and the relationships we had developed to continue to work for improving the city. And Emmett, who was my closest colleague and collaborator on it, we had a meeting of the staff of the Crime Commission after the report had been issued and said, let's organize something, we'll call it Good Government Atlanta. Clay opted out. The Hugh Peterson, who was the Deputy General Counsel, was lawyer at King and Spalding, opted out, but everybody else opted in. And we created Good Government Atlanta, and we started issuing a series of reports on community problems. The first one dealt with property taxation. It was entitled something like Atlanta, a big league city with minor league taxes. It was quite controversial, stirred up a lot of people. Our tax rates actually were quite low in those days. And we had gone to see Jack Spalding at the Constitution and Eugene Patterson at the Constitution about this idea. And Gene Patterson basically dusted us off, basically said, well, it's important people in the community like him who got things done, and we were just kids and didn't know what we were doing, and so it would really be a waste of time. He wasn't interested. Jack Spalding, on the other hand, was very encouraging, was very nice about it. So as we started releasing our reports, we always released them on the Journal's time. That is, they were the afternoon paper. If you released it after a certain time in the day, they got it first and the Constitution got it second. One of my happiest days was when Gene Patterson called and said, would we mind releasing some of our reports on his time? So the Constitution could get a first crack at it. We had always contemplated that we would need a not-for-profit arm of Good Government Atlanta because it did not qualify. It was a political action group, and it tended to be. getting a little ahead of myself. I should go to the 1969 city elections. And we had wanted to have an integrated organization. We invited a Brown classmate of mine named Joel Caruth Stokes, who was the trust officer and vice president of the Citizens Trust Bank, to serve on Good Government Atlanta's board as he did. We thought it was very important that the city elections that we have a biracial effort to elect the best people to the board of aldermen, as it was called in those days, in the Board of Education. QV was on the Board of Aldermen. Dr. Clement was on the Board of Education, but they were the only two elected black officials in the Atlanta city government. I gave a speech to surgeons on this topic, and I got invited by Young Men on the Go. You know Young Men on the Go? Lonnie King and Charles Black invited Good Government Atlanta to come talk about the elections. And we met at Fraternity House on the west side. And Lonnie basically said, now, if you'll support these black candidates, we'll support these white candidates. And we said, no deal. We're going to support the best candidates. And we think they include Ira Jackson, Marvin Arrington. We had gone out and actively solicited candidates for the Board of Education. And we got the Chamber of Commerce Education Committee to participate in this. This fellow named Frank Smith with IBM was chairman of the committee. And he and I went out and called on Dr. Mays at his home and asked him if he would run. His wife was quite ill. He was finishing a book, and he said he couldn't do it. We went and called on Dr. John Middleton at Morris Brown, and he agreed to run. Tom Beebe, who was president of Delta Airlines, had been appointed to the board, and he went out to call on Tom, and he said he wasn't going to run. We didn't need to waste our time trying to talk him out of running, and we said, quite the contrary, we're here to talk you into running. And he asked me if I would serve as his campaign chairman, which was the price I had to pay for having asked him to run. And one of our own members, Jerry Luxemburger, ran. And I then got a call from Dr. Mays asking if he could come see me. And he asked me whether I thought the Atlanta newspapers would support his candidacy if he were to run. I called Reg Murphy at the Constitution, and he said, Mike, we can't take a position in advance with respect to a candidate, but I can't conceive of a better candidate than Dr. Mays. And told Dr. Mays that, asked him if I could introduce him to Philip Alston. Philip Alston was very gracious, urged him to run, and presented him with a check for his qualifying fee. And he ran, and of course got elected. I left Joel Stokes off the list of the candidates we endorsed and supported for the Board of Aldermen, but Joel ran and was elected.
Is that list in your papers, do you think?
Well, I've got two things. Well, I got several things here for you. This is a paper I wrote, Research Atlanta, the early days, and I believe some of it is in there. Joel, of course, as you probably know, became chairman of the finance committee and then chairman of the police committee, and then he got arrested for making himself a loan at the Citizens Trust Bank in a fictitious name. And he asked me if I would represent him, which I did. I brought in Charlie Weltner to handle the criminal side of it. And Joel was ultimately convicted and spent a while in jail, which extinguished a very promising career. I think what had in fact happened is that the Citizens Trust Bank had been completely ignored by the state banking regulators for decades. Didn't care what they did. And Dr. Milton, that was Dr. Milton, wasn't it, who was president of the bank? He was also a Brown graduate, by the way. How Joel got there. Had set up scholarship programs and other things that did not comply with banking regulations, but were very beneficial to the community. And Joel's position was that the bank wanted to expand on the west side, needed a site, that it could not qualify. The bank regulators all of a sudden started taking an interest in the bank when integration became an issue. And they had basically were clamping down. And in order to get a favorable site on the west side, Dr. Milton had asked him to buy this site, finance it through a loan from the bank. And that's what he'd done. And in any event, he went to jail for it.
That was the site that's on Hunter, was on Hunter Street.
It was on Hunter Street somewhere, yeah.
The sort of first branch that they had.
Yeah.
That was my parents' branch.
Yeah, my guess is that was the same site, but I don't know that for sure. Yeah. So we went through this political process, and we were writing reports. And there was a professor at Georgia Tech named Rod O'Connor, who was quite a remarkable man. He was in the business school, and he had won been given the top national awards of the country of Colombia, and I believe of Ecuador, for his work in South America. And as you probably don't know, Georgia Tech had a ton of South American students in those days. And for whatever reason, they came to Tech. And he had some theories about how you strengthen communities that he had applied in Colombia, and quite successfully, before the drug cartels came on the scene. And he wanted to apply those same concepts to Atlanta. And Tom Cousins agreed to fund a series of meetings that I know included Paul Austin from Coca-Cola and Jim Furness, who had been a senior officer at the CNS Bank, and they'd become CEO of Great American Mortgage Investors, which was then the third or fourth largest real estate investment trust in the country, headquartered in Atlanta. And some other folks. And for whatever reason, Rod selected as the first presenters, I believe the first presenters were John Coxon, the Butler Street YMCA, John having by that time succeeded Franklin. Franklin had gone into the city government as head of the Human Resources at City Hall under Sam Sell. And John had become the executive director of the Butler Y. The second presenter were Good Government Atlanta. And as part of our pitch, we said we really needed a public interest research organization that could develop information that could be relied upon, nonpartisan, and that we needed it needed to qualify as a charitable organization. And after that meeting, Tom Cousins called Bob Hunter, who was an officer of Cousins Properties, but also as Secretary of Good Government Atlanta, and asked whether if he were to give us $100,000 for his foundation to start this organization, which we refer to as Research Atlanta, started up, could we do that? And Emmett and I got together with Bob and decided that we should ask him to give us $33,000 a year for 3 years, and that so we could use that money as a start on raising funds. There was a fellow at the CNS Bank, Bill Van Landingham, who is head of their public service program, including spring cleaning Atlanta. Anyone ever mentioned spring cleaning Atlanta? This was an incredible program of the CNS Bank that was active for several years in the early 70s, where the bank officers, the bank hired trucks, bought paint, brushes, so forth, organized communities, in poor communities in Atlanta, and for one day, one Saturday, went into the community, painted houses, picked up the trash, hauled away the stuff that had been sitting in people's backyards for years that they couldn't get the city to haul away. Bill had been in charge of that in Savannah and then came to Atlanta. In any event, he came on board, and the CNS Bank gave us money, Coca-Cola gave us money, a number of others, and we hired as our first director a fellow named Sam Williams, not the minister, but the fellow who's president of the Chamber of Commerce today. As first executive director of Research Atlanta, Tred Davis, Emmett Bondurant, myself, Clay Long came back on the board, having passed up Good Government Atlanta, and that's all in here. Because it led into Good Government Atlanta and Research Atlanta were paired for quite a long while. And I think you probably know, of course, Good Government Atlanta functioned from the early 70s through, Research Atlanta into the 2000s, when it was folded in with the Metro Group into the Atlanta Civic League.
Could you say something, if we could go back a minute, what you were saying about Mills Lane and Yale and the honorary
He did not think it appropriate for Yale to give Martin Luther King Jr. an honorary degree for whatever reason, and announced that to Yale and cut off his financial support to Yale, if I'm not mistaken. This is quite out of character for him, or either that or he grew a lot. But that, we need to go back now to the action forum. I believe that there was a coalition in the African American community that Bill Calloway, who was a real estate broker, was the principal spokesman for. And Massell had not been supported by the business community, the white business community. It was the first mayor elected in decades who had not had the support of the Atlanta business community. They supported Rodney Cook, who was a city councilman, was a Republican, but it was totally a nonpartisan issue. And Sam, for some reason, had ruffled feathers, and the business community decided they'd support Rodney. And I remember a meeting, which I still think is quite unbelievable, in the main meeting hall at City Hall, where I invited the business, basically white business people were there, and Mayor Allen was basically endorsing Rodney. And in comes Sam Massell, uninvited, in the back. Says, thought he ought to be there since he was running too. Leroy Johnson ran, of course. I think the Atlanta Negro Voters League, I guess Leroy may have been chairman. He was chairman of it, by the way, at the time of the '69 elections. And we had, Good Government Atlanta had gone to the Negro Voters League requesting their support for Tom Beebe, Jerry Luxemburger, and other candidates for both the city council and the Board of Education. And I think without exception, our views coalesced and overlapped. In any event, I guess it was during the Massell era that Bill Calloway, on behalf of the black community, went to Mills Lane and said, we think that we're all in this boat together, and what happens to Atlanta is going to affect you as well as us, and that we need to sit down and talk about it. I had, I guess a year or so before this, written this paper called Atlanta the Next 10 Years, talking about exactly the same problem, and basically saying that Atlanta would either be a truly integrated city or a black city, and that the Atlanta power structure must take a firm position to actively support for integration, give active support to integration if Atlanta is to survive as other than a black city. And the various elements of the power structure must face up to their responsibility with respect to black employment, black executive recruitment and development, commitment of resources within the city limits, and support of integration with the resources of their organization, annexation, public school improvement, and so forth. And I'd given a copy of this to Philip Alston, who had given a copy of it to Mills Lane. And to my, I'd say very considerable surprise, Mr. Lane came to my office to talk about it and to thank me for it. And whether or not that influenced him, I don't know. But in any event, he jumped on board with Bill Calloway and said, we're going to do this. And he said, we're going to just pick people on the white side who care about the issue. This is not a question of who's the most important muckety-muck in town, but who, if we asked them to come and meet, would be willing to do so and would do so with a positive attitude. And this is a history of the Action Forum I wrote. I've only got 2 left. I'd be glad to lend this to you to copy, and I didn't get a chance to copy it myself. And I know it's in the archives at Georgia State. And of course, the initial white members were Paul Austin at Coke, Tom Beebe at Delta, Lee Burge at what's now Equifax, Tom Cousins, Larry Gellerstadt at his construction company, Mills Lane, John Portman, Billy Stern from SunTrust, and myself. And I didn't fit in this at all. I never knew why they asked me to serve. I assumed it had something to do with this, but I don't know. And on the black side, of course, Bill Calloway, Fletcher Coombs, John Cox, Jesse Hill, Lonnie King, Jim Pascal, Charles Reynolds, Herman Russell, Lyndon Wade, and Q.V. Williamson. Mr. Lane was the white co-chairman, and Bill Calloway was the black co-chairman. Mr. Lane had 2 heart attacks and a couple of years later in his early 60s and had to withdraw from everything. And Billy Stern took his place as the White co-chairman. And that will give you some flavor of what the issues were. We met monthly, usually on Saturday morning for the first several years. Then at the Commerce Club during the week, on a weekday morning for another couple of decades. And I think did an enormous amount of good for the city. It started to peter out probably in the 90s. And part of what happened, I think, was that the positions it was highly prized on both sides. And the people came. They came almost without fail. They were out of town, came from back just for the meeting, and put a lot of energy into addressing the problems. And I think in many cases very successfully. But for instance, we had Ed Smith, who was president of the First National Bank of Atlanta, wasn't a participant because Mr. Lane did not, well, he didn't like the First National Bank, but also didn't think Ed Smith gave a hoot, which was may have been correct. But in due course, Tom Williams, who became Ed Smith's successor at First National, came on the forum, and he was a very positive, constructive member. But the positions became vested in the organizations the people represented rather than based on their level of interest in the issue. That was clearly part of the problem. So you started getting some people who weren't as committed, weren't as interested. And then, of course, we had branch banking. So the banks were no longer locked up in Atlanta, and their level of interest declined. And they had their own financial problems that were just quite distracting. And many of the major Atlanta companies were becoming national, international companies, and Atlanta's importance to them became less. And they were importing people as the chief executive officers who weren't from Atlanta, like the people at Coke or the people at Bell South. Although John Clendenin, who was one of those who came in from the outside, was a fabulous public-spirited citizen. But you still didn't have that same love, commitment, involvement in the city. Then at some point, we had a rule that you couldn't be a member if you were a politician. QV was the initial exception to that rule. Not that if you were a politician, if you were a public office holder. And when Maynard went out, he came onto the forum and he became the African American co-chair. And I'm a great admirer of Maynard's. I was chairman of Lawyers for Maynard Jackson in both of his campaigns. First campaigns, we were the only biracial group in the city supporting him. But Maynard was a political guy. And the balance at the meetings shifted more and more toward purely black issues, employment, but business opportunities for the African American members. And the whites many of the white members stopped coming. And it was repetitive. There wasn't any real break in this. Every meeting was about this, which had not been true over the years in a balanced perspective. And I know that the white CEOs had been told by their lawyers, you don't want to go to a meeting and talk in public about your employment practices, because they may be misunderstood. You may get quoted when you didn't expect to be, and I think that pushed people away. And it got to the point that Charlie Loudermilk, Sam Williams, who was then, I guess, with the Chamber, and me, the fellow who was president of Georgia Power, Dahlberg, were about the only white members who were coming with any degree of regularity. And we had had an annual Christmas party, which was a formal event, which with spouses, and it was really a wonderful event. And most of us looked forward to it. That was petering out, and so someone got the idea. Roy Barnes was then governor. He invited the Action Forum members to the governor's mansion for the Christmas party. And it was, I think only 3 or 4 white folks showed up. And that was sort of, Maynard had they called the meeting, asked me to come. John Cox was there. Art McClung was there to talk about how we could get the Action Forum revived. And at the time, the white co-chairman had become a guy named Gary something. He was the first, he was the Wachovia Bank's representative in Atlanta. And I guess he was an important guy, but I guess it doesn't matter. And he wanted the Action Forum to be a 911 emergency group. If a problem came up, they'd meet. But if you wouldn't meet on a regular basis, you wouldn't have the regular contact and personal involvement. And so it had basically, at some point, and I'm guessing this is late 90s, maybe, might have been even, no, probably late to mid to late 90s. I don't think, there may have been one such meeting. But in any event, I was asked if I was told by Art that David Ratcliffe at Georgia Power was interested in it being a more regular event and wanted to revive it. And how could we do that? And I volunteered to go talk to Gary and told him that David would like to take the lead, and he was delighted to be relieved of the burden, and David did take it on, and I think Bill Clement was the co-chair, and there were 3 or 4 meetings held at Georgia Power, their old building over there on Forest Avenue, but no, it's Ralph McGill. And it had virtually every prominent business executive in Atlanta in the group. I was away for a couple of the meetings. And they had a Christmas event that I gather was not a big success. And David got to be president of Southern Company, and Art said just thought they were going to pitch in the towel. So the Action Forum ceased to exist.
What do you think were some of the sort of particular accomplishments? Because one of the things I guess I sort of feel about it is that it was one of those things that prevented problems. I mean, it was sort of anticipating and kind of helped sort of work through things so you didn't have a 911 kind of situation. So, I mean, what were some of the ways that you think you...
Well, start with MARTA. MARTA, the initial vote had been lost. It was an early issue, and it was decided that we needed to find some way to make it work. African American support had not been strong, and the basic issue was jobs and opportunity and service to the African American community. And Mr. Lane and the white participants basically agreed to the program that was presented. In terms of jobs, the Perry Home Ranch, which of course was a crazy, totally irrational thing at this point in time. It should have gone to Marietta, but the money got put in that wayward branch out there. That's, well, any event, the action form signed on. I know Mr. Lane put up a good deal of money to help fund work in the African American community to support the program, and the referendum passed by 400 or 500 votes. And I guess, I don't know if whether Jesse Hill had been on the board to begin with. I think he ended up on the board. Another early issue was education. And Dr. Letson, who was the superintendent, was, well, as we've learned since, that to be a school superintendent of a major city, you have to be a very strong, bullheaded, determined person. We haven't had any successful ones who weren't. And Dr. Letson was thought to be a problem. The school administration was not integrated to speak of. There were a token one or two blacks. So it was decided, I'm sorry, this is very rare that I get a call, so if you don't mind, let me just see who's calling. Hello? Yes. No, this is Mike Trotter. You've got the wrong number. It's all right. I've got a lunch at 12:30, and I thought they might be calling about that. Let's see.
So you're talking about
Schools.
education
Yeah.
in schools.
So basically agreed to support a plan to find an African American superintendent of quality. That was Dr. Krim. And to basically the new senior administrators were appointed, so there were two in every position, one black and one white. And this was part of the desegregation plan for the schools, and it all got wrapped together. Lonnie King was president of the local NAACP. I'd been appointed to the biracial committee to advise the school system with respect to the operation of a unitary school system, and several other people who were also in this group were on it. And so we all worked, and we had our new school board, who we had a major role in helping elect. And so we worked out the Atlanta plan, and the action form supported that. I know that Underground Atlanta at one point was a major issue. It was failing. And we, the Action Forum, the white participants agreed to pony up a number of millions of dollars to refurbish it and fix it. Unfortunately, I haven't been there in years. I guess it's still there.
It's still there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the remarkable things that happened was we invited Judge Bell, who was then on, of course, on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, to come to our meeting and talk about desegregating the schools. And, I mean, you weren't supposed to do that. And he said Atlanta was a disgrace, that we were had the longest running school desegregation case of any major unresolved case of any city in the country. And we should be embarrassed by it, and we should settle it. And that, of course, Duke led to getting it settled. You know, there was a great flap with the NAACP about that. Lonnie and John Cox and Jesse got expelled from the board and so forth. We supported, Mayor Massell had come up with an idea for, called a two cities plan, where Atlanta, Fulton County is going to combine them somehow. I don't even remember the details of it. We supported that. When Maynard offered, I don't think this is in here, we met and we decided that the forum members, we never did anything, never said the Atlanta Action Forum does this. It was always the individual members supported. That we would support Maynard for mayor and Wade Mitchell for vice mayor. Wade Mitchell ring a bell with anyone?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I know it.
yeah, yeah. He was one of our candidates for the city council in '69. He was an All-American football player for all A's at Georgia Tech, Harvard Business School. His father had been been on the county commission. And he was really a terrific guy. And Hosea messed that up by qualifying 15 minutes before the deadline. And Dwight Fowler ended up as vice mayor of Atlanta. He and Wade were very actively opposed political opponents, though their views weren't much different. Wade had originally qualified to run from the district for the city council, or was planning to, and White moved into the district and qualified. So Wade rented an apartment in Buckhead and qualified out there. So we got involved in that. That's the last city election we got actively involved in.
And that was Maynard's first.
That was Maynard's first term. That would have been, I think, 73. John Inman was a big problem, the police chief. And we supported Maynard in easing him out, helped him do that. We actively supported the Midfield Terminal. We helped resolve the disputes over the redevelopment of Bedford Pine, which was a big fuss at the time. There's an effort to encourage public companies to increase the representation of black businessmen on their boards of directors. And people like Coca-Cola and Delta responded to that. Riches.
So how did it work? I mean, to say that you helped to support the mayor around John Inman. I mean, how did that work?
Well, on the white side, of course, these companies usually had some lobbyist or community relations person. And either that person or maybe the CEO or maybe one of his principal lieutenants would call a city council member and say, this is bad for the city and we need to get rid of this guy. And I think they may have put up some of the money that was necessary to sort of buy him out. So the city didn't have to come out of pocket on it.
And with the midfield terminal?
Well, generally the same modus operandi. There was a tie-in between Research Atlanta and the Action Forum. Because really the very first couple of meetings, we said, okay, we got a school problem, but what are the facts? And John and I volunteered Research Atlanta to develop the facts. And of course that put Sam Williams right smack dab in the middle at a very tender age, he was even younger than I was, in the middle of all this. And so Research Atlanta would do a report on education problems in the city. One of the big questions is whether the black schools got as much money per capita, per student as the white schools. Didn't. Documented that. Now I believe all these reports from Research Atlanta are in your archives, starting from the very first ones. But for 20 years, everything the Action Forum did, or most of what the Action Forum did, there was a report of some sort of Research Atlanta that provided factual support for what was done. Some things were more basically political, obviously, and they didn't need any research to do that. But, and we had a series of executive directors. We had a policy only served 2 years, and we wanted, one of our theories was that what happened to these civic organizations was they became the entrenched fiefdoms of the people who had run them, and that over time their dynamic personalities and energy got dissipated, and they became more concerned with the size of the rug in their office and their desk than with the problems. So we thought it was very important to rotate people and to have young people who we could influence, because the board of Research Atlanta was very, very actively involved in every report, reviewing, questioning, commenting. It was like most of us were lawyers, and we were like working with our younger lawyers on a brief. Where'd you get this? Why'd you say that? How do we support this? And Beth Shapiro, for instance, was one of the executive directors who's been very active in community affairs as a consultant. Dick Layton, who became the chief financial officer of the city and the head of I think he was head of two city departments, was one of our executive directors. So we viewed it as a training ground also for people to come into the community and as knowledgeable participants.
Say one more thing about the way the Action Forum operated. You said the forum itself did not take positions, but individuals were encouraged to act.
Did not take positions publicly.
Publicly, I'm sorry.
Right. And you couldn't compel anyone to support a proposition if they didn't agree with it or weren't willing to do so. So you never really took a vote, but there was always a remarkable sense of unanimity, that whatever we've been talking about and we've come to a conclusion about is something we ought to do, and people went out and did it. And I'm sure there were exceptions, but for the most part, it got done. And I could go through more of this. It depends on what you want to do.
Let me sort of ask you to step back from this detailed look at the Action Forum to assess its uniqueness. One of the things we're fascinated by is the Atlanta success in building a very dynamic city that avoided many of the problems that other cities slipped into.
Yep.
And it's sort of obvious to us that the Action Forum may have played a role in this because it took so many positions on so many well-documented things. Is this, as far as you know, what helped make Atlanta special?
I think it was. And I think the reason it worked in Atlanta and didn't work elsewhere was the fact that we had a extremely well-educated African-American leadership, and we had African-American business people. And I say this because we had cities all over the place asking us to come tell them how to do it. And I know delegation came here from Cleveland, Ohio. Felker, Ward, and I went to Baltimore to talk to the Chamber of Commerce up there. A bunch of us went to Kansas City, flown out on the Hallmark plane to talk to them. Winston-Salem, we went and met in the R.J. Reynolds top floor conference room to talk about these issues and what we had done and how we had done it. In these other communities, often the African-American leaders were ministers. And they, shall we say, were not pragmatic. They were moralistic. And they didn't approach these issues as a practical community issue. For them, it was what's right or wrong. And it wasn't a question, well, this would be good for Kansas City because, and this is what you need to do. It was that you ought to do this because it's what the Bible says and how it's your obligation to do this. The only minister who ever showed up on the board of the Atlanta Action Forum was Joe Lowry. And Joe wasn't there very long. And whether he opted out or he was asked to leave, I have no idea, because the African American members control their membership and the white members control their membership. And we never sat down with Bill Calloway and said, we think this black fellow's disruptive and you ought to take him off, or vice versa. Just didn't happen. And of course, you undoubtedly have noticed that there's been only one woman on this group, Ingrid, until basically toward the end there were a couple of others. It was never commented on, never discussed. It's just that there were no major business people who were on it, and Ingrid was on it because my law firm sued the Coca-Cola Company over the sweetener and whether Diet Coke was Coke, and because the price of Coca-Cola syrup in 1920 had been tied to the price of sugar, and sugar was a commodity, and Coca-Cola syrup went nowhere in terms of the price. And when Diet Coke came along, they claimed it wasn't subject to that agreement. And it was of a vital interest to the Coca-Cola Company, and Roberto Gosueto refused to come to meetings of the Action Forum if I was there. I didn't learn this till after the fact. But my partner, Emmett Mondrian, handled that case, and it was tried twice and ultimately lost. But by the bottlers who were fighting the Coca-Cola company over it. But in that interim period, they wanted someone from the Coca-Cola company, and if I remember this correctly, Ghost Sweater said it should be Ingrid. And the black members concurred.
So that was also the exception to, well, but I guess the other exception on that was Charlie Loudermilk. He says he was appointed by the black members.
Well, Charlie, of course, always had a good relationship with black leadership. I don't think that's quite right. I think he was the last man of prominent standing. Although I guess maybe Pete Carell. Did Pete Carell come after Charlie? This history that I wrote in '92 doesn't cover all that. Either Charlie, I think Carell was the last white co-chair before David Radcliffe, who picked it up after it basically went out. But Charlie was putting more into it than anybody else, and was more interested in it. And I think that's why he became the white co-chair.
Why do you think business leaders in Atlanta during this period cared so deeply about the city?
Well, going back to the banks to begin with, who were critical in all this, it mattered to the banks because if Atlanta didn't prosper, they didn't prosper. They could not branch outside the city of Atlanta. Now you will have seen or remember the C&S Bank of Sandy Springs, the C&S Emory Bank. Those were only 5% owned by the C&S Bank. Those were clever legal maneuvers to circumvent the restrictions of the Georgia branch banking laws. But those banks, while they had the C&S name, if you went in there to make a deposit in the C&S National Bank, they'd send you out because they were not the C&S National Bank. So in the other banks, SunTrust, First National, you go out Yucca Road, or rather Roswell Road now, and where the city limit is, there was a C&S Bank, there was a First National Bank, there was a National Bank of Georgia, camped right there within a block of the city limits, because that was as far north as you could get. So all this fast opening suburban economy was closed to the banks until that law got changed sometime in the, I guess it was sometime in the 1990s, maybe a little earlier than that. So that was part of it. Mr. Woodruff was very committed to the city. Mr. Woodruff was the most important businessman in Atlanta. He was a local boy. And he sort of set a tone that I think influenced everybody else. And I think everyone bought into the idea that a healthy Atlanta was good for business. Now, obviously, Delta Airlines thought so. The Delta CEO was always on. Coca-Cola thought so in those days because Mr. Woodruff was still around. I don't know how my sense is they may not feel quite as strongly about it today as they did then. Tom Cousins, real estate business in Atlanta mattered one heck of a lot to Tom Cousins. Larry Gellerstedt at Beers Construction mattered a lot to him.
This is the father of the current
President of Cousins Properties, yeah. Yeah, Larry Jr.'s father had been a senior vice president of the C&S Bank, and they were long, strong Atlanta people. Mills Lane, of course, was from Savannah, but he lived here from 46 on. John Portman had a substantial interest in downtown Atlanta. Billy Stern and SunTrust, because SunTrust was locked into Atlanta. So on the white side, pretty clear. I think the same thing's true on the black side. Atlanta Life, Herman Russell, Jesse, who were the dominant business figures in the Atlanta community by far. So that's why, I think.
So when they ended branch banking, some of that intent, so the part of what happened also was people of that stature weren't as landlocked in terms of Atlanta.
And new people, tons of new people came in from outside. Well, like the Home Depot folks. And all these companies that have relocated to Atlanta from other cities. And the people often don't live in the city of Atlanta. So, and their focus is nationally or international, and they get pulled in a little bit, probably more so than they do in a lot of other cities, but still it's different.
This has been fascinating to me to hear these stories this way. Don't know that I'd had much of this information.
No. Kalechi, did you have any questions?
Oh, I'm just fascinated.
Well, our youth question is our graduate student question, and Kalechi's a doctoral student at Georgia State, is always, what's the message to the next generation of Atlanta leaders?
I found it very disappointing. I can't find who they are, particularly on the white side. We tried to keep good government Atlanta going, and got Lonnie King, Charles Black, Norman Johnson. Just not been able to find white people who are interested. I think a lot of the activity was from lawyers in the earlier days, and the lawyers are so overworked and they're so motivated by money that they rarely, in the younger generations, get involved in this stuff.
Yeah, they really...
And I'm not sure they can with the pressures that are on them, though it's a decision of lifestyle. And
Do you think some of the practices, some of the way of doing things that were pioneered in the Action Forum maybe has also influenced how other groups operate now?
Well, I think there is probably still a deep, abiding faith in what is good for the community is good for business among a substantial number of people. So that you, through your the chambers of commerce, for instance, there's still interest and concern in the community institutions.
What do you think made the Action Forum different from the chamber? How did it, and how was it a complement, or why was it necessary? In addition to sort of having a, integration in the chamber.
Well, there was a much more balanced relationship in the Action Forum than there would have ever been, even is today, in the chamber, obviously. So, and I think the African American leadership recognized that this was their institution as well, and they were at least equal partners in it. And I think they were treated as equal partners. Though in some respects, in terms of intellectual content, ideas, love of the community, obviously didn't have the resources, financial resources, but there was a great spirit of camaraderie. People really liked one another.
And sort of seem to have that respect. The thing that amazes me about it is that there was such an imbalance in terms of the financial resources, but that there still was, like you said, that sort of sense of an equal partnership in the organization.
Well, I think it was the political on one side and the economic on the other. And everyone knew that where the political power was, or thought we knew until Bill Campbell got elected mayor. And that's, of course, another story. I have some other things I wanted to give you. This was a letter I was very proud of, but which illustrated a point. I sent it to the members of the Action Forum in March of '72. It just basically said, I wanted to share with each of you an additional suggestion concerning black employment in Atlanta, which relates primarily to your professional advisors, but may also have something to say generally. There's no question that lawyers, accountants, and others who work for major businesses in Atlanta remain concerned as to the reception of black professionals would receive from their clients. It is both a major reason and a major excuse why all the professional firms have not moved more aggressively in employing black personnel, and has been an inhibiting factor for those who have employed blacks. Those of you who direct the affairs of major businesses could help this situation materially by notifying your professional advisors that you and your staff have no objection to working with black professionals. If you were willing to say that you would like for your professional advisors to seek qualified black personnel, it would be an additional help. Furthermore, it is maybe important to make it clear throughout your organization that it is your policy, the policy of your company, to work with the personnel of your professional advisors regardless of their race or sex. Paren, another problem, close paren. I mention that because a couple of weeks later, Philip Alston came into my office and said, "What have you been up to?" And I said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, "Why did X, who was a senior partner at King & Spalding, call me this morning and tell me to tell you to keep your goddamn nose out of their business?" And I therefore surmised that Billy Stern had called them up.
What year was that?
1972.
It took them a long while to adjust their personnel problems around gender or race.
Yep. My law firm sued them in the Hishon case. That was Emmett again. This is the speech I gave to the Rotary Club in '93 about public education in Atlanta. And this is the speech I gave to the Rotary Club in '97 about public housing in Atlanta and why we needed to do what we've done. And this is a speech I gave at the Hungry Club in 1991 about race relations in Atlanta. I had been asked to talk to the Hungry Club in 1969 about the city elections, and 22 years later I got invited back. Said I hope I didn't have to wait till I was 76 to get invited again. It looks like I'm not going to make it.
So this, can we
You can have
copy
that.
this and
Yeah.
send that back to you?
Yep. Yep. Fine.
We'll be glad to do that.
Yep. Okay.
Do you see the Atlanta Committee for Progress continuing some of the work that the Action Forum started?
It's clearly intended to. I've not been involved with it and don't know.
Okay.
For sure. I do know on the school side, and I've been very disappointed in what's happened there. I was chair of a committee of the chamber in '91 actually what happened, Maynard called me and said that he was meeting with the presidents of the major banks, and they would like to have a study of the financial condition and prospects of the city of Atlanta and of the Atlanta Public Schools. And could I arrange for Research Atlanta to do that? I had gone back on the board. And we had a disastrous executive director who and a worthless staff. And I did not think they could do the job. So I was able to raise some money from Delta and Genuine Parts and got the study housed at the chamber. And we put out a report on the financial condition and prospects of the Atlanta Public Schools, which was quite critical of a lot of things, the way the schools were run. The schools, of course, were in disastrous condition. And this is, by the way, another example of something the Action Forum did that was very useful. We had this report. I brought it to the Action Forum, and Jesse said, well, we need to appoint a committee. The elections were coming up. And we talked about it, and there was a committee of Charles Reynolds from Citizens Trust, Herman Funderburg. Was it?
Funderburg, right.
Yeah, Funderburg, Jesse, and someone else. And they came back and basically said, well, we need to have another broader committee. And I said, Jesse, I don't understand what's going on. This is a problem. It affects the African American community vastly more than it affects the white community. Why can't we deal with this? And John Cox spoke up and said, well, Mike, you need to understand that the Atlanta Public Schools are the 5th or 6th largest employer in the Atlanta metropolitan area. They're the only one we control. And every person sitting at this table probably has a contract with the Atlanta Public Schools, except me. And I guess it was Felker Ward who then said, if we take on Ina Evans, and this is about the election, Ina Evans and who was the guy from Morris Brown? Who's the professor, Morris Brown? Incredibly, and the school board was an absolutely incredible mess. I mean, we had people coming to town, watching TV in their room and seeing the school board meeting and thinking it was a sitcom. I mean, literally saying, I watched the funniest show I've seen in years. And people were yelling at one another. What station is that? What's the name of that program? Well, that was the Atlanta Public Schools Board of Education. Well, Felker said, if we oppose Ina and the other guy, and we lose, we're toast. We can't afford to do that. So basically the white guys said, look, and the white guys were saying, this isn't our problem. This school system is 95, 96% black, 80-some% of the employees are black. If we start getting involved, we're going to be called racist and trying to manage black people's business for them. We don't want to do that. So we talked for about an hour, and finally agreed that the whites would take the leadership in trying to get rid of the most dysfunctional members of the school board as well. And the blacks would support it off the record, behind the scenes, and we were able to do that. We were able to elect a decent board of education. And then the question came, well, what else do you have to do? And this committee for the chamber, we had this study, and we recommended a number of changes, many of which got made. But and we created something called the Atlanta Committee for Public Education. The initial chair was a guy named, He was an African American from Macon who was on the board of the State Board of Education, a young man. And he pretty quickly, Tom Cole was elected the chairman. And very quickly, this fellow from Macon got offered a better job. He'd worked for the chamber. He went back to Macon. And we were looking for a new executive director. And I was at Michael Lomax's birthday party, and I ran into an extremely articulate, knowledgeable African-American woman named Vivian Ingersoll. And Vivian, of course, had taught at Spelman. She'd been a dean at Wellesley. She'd been a dean at Harvard. She was the director of research and policy for the State Department of Education in Massachusetts. And her husband, John, had gotten a job at Emory as a development officer, and they'd moved back to Atlanta. And I called Tom the next morning and said, I think I know who should be the executive director of the Atlanta Committee. And Vivian did a marvelous job. Her parents were elderly, and after about 6 or 7 years, she decided she had to resign in order to look after them. And we could not find a suitable successor. And we just let it hang for too long, had a deputy. And somewhere along the line, the idea came that, well, we need a new organization. And Laura Hardman, Pat Willis, and my nemesis, how could I possibly be blanking out on her, Ann Kramer, were basically working behind the scenes to put the Atlanta Committee out of business and to merge it with Apple Corps. Now, Apple Corps was a defunct organization that had been started by the Junior League. It had been predominantly a white organization, though it had integrated itself to some extent. But it was virtually out of gas, had no money, was about to shut the doors. And I've never understood why they wanted to merge it, but they decided they wanted to merge it, and Ann was able to say that the business community wanted it merged because she was the spokesman for the business community. And we had a bunch of committees, and we did studies and reports about what the direction and so forth the organization ought to be. And we had, Walter Massey had become the chairman. Walter was, I'd known Walter from Brown. He'd been dean of the college at Brown when I was on the board of trustees. Had a high regard for Walter, still do. But he had tuned out of the Atlanta Committee. He was doing other things. He was on the board of BP, and he was having dinner with the Queen on one occasion. We were having an important meeting about all of this stuff. And we got to the fateful meeting, and they'd hired a consultant who was supposed to be guiding this process, and she started talking about we were going to now elect a new board of directors. And I said, well, what about the studies that we've all spent all this time doing? What role are they to play? And she said, oh, they don't really matter because the new board will decide what it wants to do. The notice of the meeting did not include a notice of the people to be nominated. And Ann was chairman of the committee, and she was asked to report, and she reported, and there were 25 members of the board of directors, roughly, of the Atlanta Committee. 5 made the cut. There were 10 members of Apple Corps, 5 made the cut. Curly Dossman, who was one of those who made the cut, said, he was on the executive committee. I said, has the executive committee approved this? He said, no, we don't know about this. I don't think I agree with this. And I got up and walked out. And Walter said, stopped me and said, "Mike, you're leaving?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you have something you want to say?" I said, "Yes, I think this is a terrible mistake. Doesn't make any sense at all. You're eliminating Clint Dye from the Urban League. You're eliminating the president of Georgia State University, Carl Patton, who's very interested in this. And I hope it works, but I'm out of here." That ended up with what was called Great Schools Atlanta. Tom Cole was brought in as the chair and Vivian as a consultant. And they commissioned a report from a group in Charlotte who were very smart people. And this was maybe 2003, 2004. Dr. Hall had been on the scene a couple of years to review her program and what she was proposing, and we all agreed that it made a lot of sense. But that's all Great Schools Atlanta did, and the next thing we knew, we had the, what did they call it? The Atlanta School League or Fund? Atlanta Education Fund.
Education fund.
Well, there was a fellow on the board of Apple Corps who had been pushing on that from the beginning, who was a former professor at MIT. I've forgotten his name. Smart guy. And his former wife had been the director of a similar organization in Boston. He was kept on doing that. And of course, they then brought in Dr. Hall. They brought in the chamber. And from the beginning, the Atlanta Committee's view was you can't be a friendly critic of the school system if the school superintendent's sitting on your board and attending all your meetings. Well, they bought into the new model, and we know what's happened with that. And I think it was a tragic misjudgment.
Yeah, they were just sort of there to be cheerleaders.
Yeah, that's what they did. And if I've learned anything about public education, one must approach it with a great level of skepticism, because the people who are running it, it's their job, they're trying to hold on to their job, and they're going to tell you what you want to hear, and you have to ask them the right questions and insist that they answer them. And the State Board of Education started about 5 years ago keeping track of the remediation rate of high school graduates who attended public institutions in Georgia. And when the list first came out, Dr. Hall was saying the graduation rate had gone from 36% to 70+%. And it had. I mean, that percentage of the students were getting pieces of paper. The best performing Atlanta Public High School on that remediation list was Grady, because only 30% of their graduates had to take remedial courses when they got to a Georgia institution of higher education. Crim was over 70. And the Atlanta, of the 105 schools on the list, the Atlanta Public High Schools were right at the top of the list. And they just been doing what they were doing, and we now know that. But nobody was asking. I asked that question. I'm trying to I am tooting my own horn. I asked Dr. Hall that question. She said, "Oh, that's a very good question." And I asked that same question at the Chamber's meeting last December when the superintendents from Gwinnett and Cherokee and a couple of other counties were there, but not Atlanta, and they were bragging about their completion rate. And I said, "Well, what about your remediation rate?" And they said, "Oh, really? What is that?" "Oh, I think I remember that. Yeah, we really ought to look at that. That'd be an interesting number." But I say that only to illustrate the point that these people are all the same. And they probably have to be that way, but you can't let them call the shots, sit back there in great reverence and say, yes, old marvelous person that you are, superintendent of the year and all that. You got to ask the right questions.
And the dynamic is always how you keep these institutions from being great places to work for the teachers. And,
Yes.
And we always keep the focus on how are the children benefiting from what we're doing.
Yep. And you have the great problem of whether we're starting early enough.
Oh, well, we're definitely not starting
And
early.
I think that's the key problem. If you don't start
Yeah,
when they're 1 year old,
yeah.
a lot of them aren't going to make it.
And the challenge of getting organizations, policymakers, and so forth to act based on research. I mean, that maybe is another great lesson of the action forum, is that you looked at the facts and then tried to actually do something that was relevant to what the facts and the research were indicating, even though, it might be difficult for people. But so often there's so much that we know, like the need for early education. We know it works. And, we still don't make the investment.
Yep. We should be better off chopping off the last 2 grades and adding 2 on the front.
Yeah, yeah. Well, great. Well, this has been great, and we really appreciate your.
Can I ask just one?
Okay.
I know you've talked so much about race relations, about business, and I'm just wondering if it's even possible, to sum up in a couple of sentences, a paragraph, about what is the Atlanta way. You talked about the education level of African American. I mean, you just talked about so many things, and I'm just wondering if you could wrap us up.
Well, that's very difficult.
Oh,
Yeah.
and just
Yes.
to make it even harder, has the Atlanta way shifted, changed? Is it different from maybe 30 years ago?
Well, Atlanta's a very different place than it was 30 years ago. It's a much larger place, and the city of Atlanta itself is a tiny part of the whole. And that wasn't true 30 years ago. The city of Atlanta was the driving force of the metropolitan area. We have this enormous problem of fragmentation. We have all these counties, we have all these school districts, we have all these towns and cities, and they can't agree on anything. And as we've permitted this sprawl to occur across jurisdiction, the ability to come together as a group and address anything has virtually disappeared. You have the regional commission, you have these SPLOS kinds of things that we do, and so that it isn't impossible. I think the Civic League is probably a bust. The Metro Group, you're familiar with the Metro Group?
Mm-mm.
This was a group that George Heery put together to focus on metro problems. And because of his background as an architect and an engineer, they focused on the airport and on water and sewer. Their major focuses. And they were merged into the Civic League along with Research Atlanta. Research Atlanta had an endowment of about $400,000. And Alicia Phillips has assured me that it's being used to do research on Atlanta issues. I haven't seen any of that research.
It's kind of a painful chapter in organizational history.
Well,
We'll talk about machine law.
well, one of the colossal errors that was made along the way was dumping Georgia State by Research Atlanta. And the guy who did that is now, I think, chairman of the Civic League, which gives me no great optimism about their future. But we brought in Debbie McCarty. Yeah. And Debbie thought her job was not to do the work, but to supervise other people doing the work, but we spent the entire budget on her salary. And we were getting 3 or 4 reports a year from Georgia State, and then with her, we were getting none for the same amount of money. And that's a terrible mistake.
That was the bad decision that cost us what we have. The only positive thing that I can say is about 4 or 5 years ago now, the Atlanta Committee for Progress, which is kind of a successor to the Action Forum, began talking with us and looking to us to provide some research capacity for them. And some of that work has been very helpful, I think, to that organization. I did a 3-year project for them, and it sort of demonstrated that we still have that Research Atlanta capacity. And throughout the process, we continued to talk about how do we institutionalize that. We still aren't there yet, but that's part of the conversation.
Yeah, good. I wonder who's getting the income from the $400,000 endowment.
Not Georgia State. I mean, we're providing the space, which is sort of a substantial income contribution for the Civic League, but it hasn't been a robust organization since the Debbie McCarty era. I guess I did one of the last Research Atlanta reports, that Olympic legacy housing study that seems now to have found a new life.
Yeah.
Well, this comes back to your question, and the part of what we're talking about here is that there's so many jurisdictions. There's an organization that tries to be over all of them is probably impossible. There are just too many conflicting interests pulling off in every direction, and everybody wanting their particular little piece of it to get the benefit or be the best or get special consideration or what have you. And I don't know how you fix that.
But to have that small, informal group meeting out of the spotlight is very difficult to replicate
Today.
Yeah.
in today's Atlanta.
So someone would have blown the whistle, and there'd be a blog that would say, "Did you know that Larry Gellerstedt and Mills Lane and Jesse Hill and Herman Russell are meeting to determine your future?" Yeah. So that's another problem. The wide openness of everything makes it very hard for a limited group of people to get together and talk about it. And they're likely to be mistrusted in any event, but in this case it didn't matter because of who they were, and many of them were trusted.
And I think the dynamic that you encountered also in the Atlanta public school issue is also much more with leaders in the black business community, is that their financial interests are so intertwined now with the public sector contracting.
Yeah.
It's hard to find people who are not, who sort of have the kind of independence. In a way, segregation provided a kind of independence because you had to make your money off the black community or else you just went broke.
Well, and the problems to be addressed were so severe that, and they affected everybody in the community. So I was at a Atlanta region, not Atlanta region, the regional council program at Georgia State on the anniversary of the Brown decision, and distinguished academics, more who were African Americans than whites, up there giving talks, and African Americans were saying nothing's changed. Things are bad now as they were 30 years ago. And I just, I wanted to say, ladies and gentlemen, you wouldn't be there.
Right.
You wouldn't be anywhere close to where you are today. Have you read The Ordeal of Integration by Orlando Patterson?
No. I know Orlando.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I think it's the best thing out there. And it basically says we've made a tremendous, unbelievable amount of progress in a short period of time. We still have a long way to go.
Right.
And I think that's where we are.
That sums it up. Yeah, I always say, well, that people who say that either weren't here, or my mother used to say that what you're remembering, being a member of the elite part of the black community is what you're remembering. And when you get nostalgia about what it was like 30, 40 years ago.
Yep. Yep.
I'd like to thank you for your willingness to sit down with us.
You're very welcome.
The time that you've spent.
Oh, you're very
This has
welcome.
been very helpful. We will certainly see that these are archived appropriately. An institution that's meant a lot to your family over the years.
Good. Anything else comes up, let me know.
We will get this back to you. We appreciate